All right, welcome to Talmudim Way and our fourth lesson in Revelation backgrounds. Today we'll be covering the last 8 verses of Revelation chapter 1, and that is verses 12 through 20. And we'll also be looking at some parallel passages in Daniel 7 and Daniel 10. I'm calling this one one like a son of man, and that is both a statement because that's who John says he saw in Revelation 1:13, but to me it's also a question, right? Who is this son of man? John knew Jesus better than anyone, and yet he doesn't say this is Jesus. So I think logically, almost any Christian would agree that this vision is depicting a glorified Jesus. But nonetheless, we have to acknowledge that John never once identifies this person speaking to him as Jesus. So we'll dig into this as we move forward. Acts 17:11 says we should receive the word with all readiness of mind and search the scriptures daily to see whether these things are so. So the first part of this video is going to be me reading a lot of these Old Testament passages from Daniel 7 and Daniel 10 just to get our bearings and set up a comparison between those writings and Revelation 1. Then we'll get into the verse by verse of Revelation 1 with the Messiah glorified. We'll talk about him as high priest, the Ancient of Days, and then he says, "Fear not." One theme that will kind of be running through is this Jesus talking or an angel talking? Because John never exactly says it's Jesus talking. So it's something to keep in mind there. And then we'll close with a postscript on Revelation 1 and Daniel 10 parallels. So first we'll start with Revelation 1, and then we'll get into Daniel 7 and 10 and get a feel for the similarities. Revelation 1 verse 12, I turned around to see who was speaking to me, and when I had turned I saw 7 gold menorahs, and among the menorahs was someone like a son of man, wearing a robe down to his feet and a gold band around his chest. His head and hair were white as snow, white wool, his eyes like a fiery flame, his feet like burnished brass refined in a furnace, and his voice like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. Out of his mouth went a sharp double-edged sword, and his face was like the sun, shining in full strength. When I saw him, I fell down at his feet like a dead man. He placed his right hand upon me and said, Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last, the living one. I was dead, but look, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys to death and Sheol. So write down what you see, both what is now and what will happen afterwards. Here is the secret meaning of the 7 stars you saw in my right hand, and of the 7 gold menorahs. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 messianic communities, and the 7 menorahs are the 7 messianic communities. So what we just read is the vision of the risen Christ, as it's been called in Revelation chapter 1, and it has several similarities. There are some differences, but mostly a lot of similarities with Daniel 7 and Daniel 10. So before we begin a verse-by-verse study of Revelation, I think it's beneficial to go ahead and read these Daniel passages. Daniel 7, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. The beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and exceedingly dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke into pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So in verse 8 there we see this character that we will become familiar with as we read Revelation. It's the Antichrist. And since that term can be a little bit emotionally charged and bring certain things to our mind, Chuck Missler prefers to call this guy either the coming world leader based on his political domination, or based on this mouth that boasts and brags. You see there a mouth speaking great things. Chuck also calls him, kind of in a silly way, he calls him Mr. Big Mouth. And then also we see in verse 8 another horn, a little one. So if you hear the term little horn, that also refers to this leader, this coming leader that we will call the Antichrist. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. So are we seeing a connection with Revelation 1? I think we are. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open. I looked then because the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, there's the big mouth guy again. And as I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So Revelation is partially repeating this description of the Ancient of Days. All Daniel saw here was that the books were opened, but Revelation is going to give us the details of what was on the pages. So for Daniel 7, this is really the part we want to focus on. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning these things. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. So dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that sounds an awful lot to me like the kingdom, power, and the glory. Not exactly the same words, but I think there's definitely a connection there, and that's why Jesus had us pray those words when he taught us what's called the Lord's Prayer, or it was really the disciples' prayer. One suggestion, in verse 15, we see that Daniel's alarmed. So possibly one commentator picked up that this could have been a paradigm shift. So in the prevailing view of that day, Messiah was not necessarily God, was not necessarily deity. Yet in verse 13, Daniel sees the Ancient of Days, the one who we might call the Father, giving the kingdom, the power, and the glory to one like a son of man who we would identify as Jesus. So Walton in the IVP Bible Background Commentary notes that Jewish writings from before the time of Jesus did view the Son of Man as the Jewish Messiah, and that's in like a first century before the Common Era document. So John would have definitely been familiar with these documents, particularly the book of First Enoch. And of course, the earliest Christians knew that this Son of Man, they saw the Son of Man as Jesus. So the rest of Daniel 7 goes on to describe the interpretation of the prophecy. We're not directly concerned with that in Revelation 1, although we will get to it later in Revelation. So I think it's worth it to go ahead and finish this chapter out here. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. So if you remember the first three, whatever he saw, he could put into animal terms. So, a bear or a lion. But this fourth one was so terrible and awful that he couldn't. Verse 20, about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, and the horn that had an eyes and a mouth that spoke great things. There's that Mr. Big Mouth again. And that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them. That's not good. Until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, trample it down, and break it into pieces. So, unfortunately, if you're looking for support against a pre-trib rapture, you might look at verse 21, because the horn made war with the saints. But the good news is that in the Ancient of Days will come and set it right. And again, that is the purpose of one of the purposes of apocalyptic literature, is to bring comfort to his people who are suffering in exile and suffering persecution. Verse 24, as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment. His dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed in the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. So we see in verse 26 that there is this, it says the court shall sit in judgment. And then we could say that at the end of the book we're studying, Revelation, contains those court transcripts. So we're going to see this struggle where this world leader, this Mr. Big Mouth, will reign for a time, but then he'll be put down, and then God will make everything right. So again, Daniel was alarmed at the end of this, possibly because he saw the pain the saints will suffer. But again, ultimately, in the end, God wins. Next, let's look at Daniel 10. Daniel 10 is actually just the story of the visitation and how this angelic being made his way to Daniel. The prophecy itself occurs in Daniel 11. So chapter 11 will be beyond our scope for this lesson because it deals with history of what is called the intertestamental period. And that's the 400, what we call the silent years between the book of Malachi, the last book of the Bible, of the Old Testament, and leading up to the birth of the Messiah. So people didn't see God moving, but what happened was God recorded the history in advance, and it's recorded in Daniel 11. So it's absolutely fascinating to see the details of this history that were forecasted in advance, but we'll save that for another time. A note on the chronology. So several years passed between Daniel 7 and Daniel 10. Walton, in his commentary, estimates Daniel 7 was around 552, somewhere between 552 and 549 BCE, during the Babylonian reign of Belshazzar. And then Daniel 10 was, nearly maybe over 20 years later, 537, 536, during the Persian reign of King Cyrus. And he notes that Daniel 10 was written very close to the time when the first wave of Jews were returning from the captivity and starting the process to rebuild the second temple that we read about in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So again, note the description of the angelic messenger and then Daniel's reaction, and then we'll compare that to Revelation 1 as we get moving. So everything in gold that I have on the screen is going to have a direct parallel in Revelation 1. So Daniel 10. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. On the 24th day of the 1st month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face was like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze. We saw that in Daniel 7. And the sound of his words were like the sound of the multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. And behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understanding and humbled yourself before God, your words have been heard, and I have come before your words. So in other words, when Daniel started his fast, is when this angel was dispatched. And we're going to see that it took him 21 days to reach his destination, which is, hard to think about because the angels can travel fast, we would think, but not this time. So verse 11, I love this. Oh, Daniel, greatly loved. Anyone know John's nickname? He was known as the beloved disciple. So it's interesting that John and Daniel are both described as being uniquely loved by God. We're all loved by God, but Daniel and John had this unique relationship, and then they both were the ones that received their respective revelations. Verse 13, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me for 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. And came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. So your people meaning the Jews or the saints of the Most High. For the vision is for days yet to come. When he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face towards the ground and was mute. And behold, one in the likeness of the children of man touched my lips. So it sounds a lot like Son of Man. Then I opened my mouth and spoke, and I said to him who stood before me, O Lord, by reason of the vision, pains have come upon me, and I retain no strength. How can my Lord's servant talk with my Lord? For now no strength remains in me, and no breath is left in me. Again, one having the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me. And he said, O man, greatly loved, there it is again, fear not, and peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Then he said, Do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. Now, Greece hadn't even arisen yet, but here's this prophecy here. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince. So we will come back to these chapters several times over the coming weeks. And if you looked at everything in gold there, that has a connection to Revelation 1, and I'll have a table summarizing all of this at the end of the lesson. So now let's move back to the verse-by-verse exposition of Revelation. I turned around to see who was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 gold menorahs. So if we remember back to verse 10, John heard a great voice behind him, and now here in verse 12, he's turning to look back to see what the commotion was. So your Bible probably says 7 lampstands or 7 candlesticks, but unquestionably this is a Jewish menorah, the 7-branched candlestick, and we see that in Exodus 27. He made its 7 lamps and its tongs and its trays of pure gold. And then Zechariah has a vision, and he said to me, What do you see? And I said, I see and behold a lampstand of all gold with a bowl on top of it and 7 lamps on it with the 7 lips on each of the lamps that are on top of it. So to me, it's unmistakable. The picture there is of the Temple Institute menorah. So they're preparing for the next temple, and we'll have some more to say about that once we get in, deeper into Revelation. But this thing is absolutely huge. I took this picture at night in 2013, and it's over 6 feet tall, and it's 100 pounds of 24 karat gold. So obviously it's surrounded by bulletproof glass there out on display. So I think it can be, why not just say menorah? Why don't our Bibles just say that? When you see references like Exodus and Zechariah, this is clearly a menorah. The problem is this can be a bit of a surprise, but once we realize how much the church has gone to strip Jesus of his Jewishness, right all the way down to our Bible translation. So I think this is just completely wrong, and it's one that we need to correct because we're basically cutting off half of the scriptures by ignoring the Old Testament, and it's something we're trying to correct with our approach here. So we'll find out later that each candlestick is actually a congregation, and we'll find that Jesus is in the midst. So Jesus absolutely should be in the midst of our congregations as well. The menorah is also reminiscent of a tree or a vine with branches. And if we've studied John 15, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. So there's that also that imagery of Jesus is in the midst and we are branching out from him. Our light is only as good as to the extent that we are connected to the main branch, right? So if we try and shine lights on our own, we'll run out of fuel, run out of brightness. So John 15 talks a lot about that. I encourage you to go back and pick that up at some point. So Jesus is the vine, we are the branches. Jesus is also the light of the world. So I mean, all of this imagery fits with this the tabernacle and the temple menorah here. So according to Chuck Missler, this scene should very much remind us of the tabernacle, because the robe and the gold band, which we'll see in verse 13, that this person is wearing is probably an allusion to the high priest garments, and we'll look at that on the next slide. The high priest was the one who tended the menorah, and that included snuffing out and correcting if anyone wasn't giving off the correct light. So we'll see that when we get to the 7 letters in chapters 2 and 3. So, and the temple, the whole point of the tabernacle was to testify of God's presence. So God is there in our midst, and that's what the picture of the tabernacle gives us. Lazorkin says the presence of the temple menorah was signal to John's audience that his visionary experience took place in the vicinity of the heavenly temple, or more precisely, the intersection of the temple. So the 7 fellowships are supposed to live in such a way that their communities see God's light and God's presence. And so again, we're always looking to how do we apply it to our day. There's a clear application there. Our lives, both individually and corporately in our fellowships, are God is present with us, and we're supposed to be reflecting God's light. There's also a reference, number 17. So when Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from above the mercy seat that was on the Ark of Testimony from between the 2 cherubim. So there's this parallel here going on with the entire temple and then tabernacle. Verse 13, and among the menorahs was someone like a son of man. So where have we seen that before? We saw that in Daniel. Wearing a robe down to his feet and a gold band around his chest. So again, Exodus 28. So in Exodus 20 is the 10 Commandments. And then after that are several chapters that deal with the tabernacle and the implements and the vessels and the garments and all that. So Exodus 28:4, these are the garments that they shall make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a colt of checker work, a turban, and a sash. They shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother and his sons to serve me as priests. And then we already looked at Daniel 7:13, one like a son of man. Daniel 10:5, the person was wearing a belt of fine gold. Daniel 10:16, one of the likeness of the children of man, or the son of man touched my lips. There are some great quotes from commentaries as to what's going on here. So Dr. Baruch Korman, a Messianic Jew commentator, wrote, this is a depiction of Messiah taking on the mantle of God the Father, which that's a great picture. Dr. Lazorkin writes, these garments are highly symbolic, showing that Jesus is the heavenly priest, fully prepared and qualified to carry out his duties. That's a good one. And then Dr. Keener, in his cultural commentary, wrote, the cumulative impact of these images is to present the risen Jesus as the greatest conceivable figure. And that is just awesome. So this photo shows the holy place, which is where inside the tabernacle, which is where the menorah was located. And you can see a replica of the menorah on the center left. This is from the Tabernacle Experience model that one can visit. It's down in the south of Israel near Eilat, and it's out in the wilderness, literally. So it's kind of a neat setting there. In the foreground, on the right side, we see the table of showbread, and then back by the curtain, that structure is the altar of incense. And then the curtain itself, you're looking into the holy place, and then behind the curtain would be the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. So it's as we said in the opening, it's very interesting that John says this is like a son of man. So he does not identify this as Jesus. So I find this a little bit puzzling, because John and Jesus were very close during Jesus' ministry, and presumably he would have said, and among the menorahs was Jesus wearing a robe, right? But he didn't say that. So something else is going on here. I don't think it's that significant, because whoever this was has the authority to speak about Jesus in the first person. And if you're familiar with the angel of the Lord, there's that kind of thing going on here as well, where it almost becomes indistinguishable that, first of all, the angel of the Lord shows up and is talking to someone like Abraham, and then all of a sudden you get the sense that you're just talking to God directly. So I think that's sort of what's going on here. We know from Revelation 1 verse 1, as well as Revelation 22:8, that John is not talking directly with Jesus. So the scriptures bear this out. So this angelic divine being, this one like a son of man, is at the same time Jesus, but not quite Jesus. And again, this is not a big deal, at least not to me, but it's just something we want to keep in mind. We touched on the parallels with the Daniel passages before, with the one like the Son of Man. And in a way, it fits that this would not be Jesus, because Jesus is physically seated at the right hand of the Father, and he does not leave that seat even to show John around heaven until it's time, until the appointed time for his second coming. So there is that kind of continuity there. But also in an equally real sense, Jesus is also in the midst of us and of our fellowships as well. Verse 14, his head and hair were white as snow, white wool, his eyes like a fiery flame. And again, we saw those connections in Daniel 7 and Daniel 10. And also, this is a bit reminiscent of the transfiguration in Matthew 17. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Verse 15, his feet like burnished brass refined in a furnace, and his voice like the sound of rushing waters. And so as a biblical type, whenever you see brass, that speaks of judgment. And kind of what you see in the pictures are bronze greaves, and greaves are Greaves, and that's armor. If you're up on armor, you probably know that, but I had to look it up. Armor that protects the legs and the shins, and this is from about 300 BC. So again, we saw parallels in Daniel 10, and then also Ezekiel 43:2. And behold, the glory of God of Israel was coming from the east, and the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. So we can see that these descriptions, John just didn't pull these out of the air. I mean, these are all connected back into these Old Testament prophecies. So verse 16, in his right hand he held 7 stars. Out of his mouth went a sharp double-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its full strength. So picture is a sunrise over the coastline at Assos in western Turkey, so not far from our 7 churches. So this image of the sharp 2-edged sword coming out of his mouth, clearly that is symbolic. You occasionally will see drawings of Jesus with a literal sword coming out of his mouth, and it looks rather silly, kind of grotesque sometimes. And more to the point, it misses the point, because we hold a sword with our hands, we hold a literal sword with our hands. We hold a figurative sword, is the word of God. And so that is, it's not meant to imply a weapon in the sense of, a sword of steel, but the word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, and that's what Hebrews says in verse 4, Hebrews 4, verse 12. The word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, just like a knife would, discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. So early Jewish believers saw these 2 edges as 2 aspects of the Word of God. So either some reference the law and the prophets, because Jesus said, they have Moses and the prophets. Other views could be Moses and Jesus, and then by extension the law of Moses, and then the gospel of Jesus. But note that they're not opposites, right? They're 2 sides of the same sword. Unfortunately, many of us have been taught that, especially for Protestants, that law is bad, gospel is good. That's not true. Law came from God. It came from God's hand. It came from Jesus' hand. Jesus wrote the law. So let's not forget that. The opposite of law is not grace. And then we're often taught that. The opposite of law is lawlessness, and the enemy is the lawless one. So that's what we need to avoid. So if this is the model, I think, the law and the gospel are both equipped to bring judgment for the wicked and life for the righteous. So we see that going on here. Dr. Baruch also pointed out that a sword can also divide and separate in the sense of Genesis 1 verse 4, where God divided the light from the darkness. And so we see this, the darkness, if you're in the dark, thinking of John 3 verse 19, the men love darkness because their deeds were evil, kind of thing. And so we want to be light, and so we want to separate light from dark, and we'll see that as Revelation unfolds. I saw a meme recently that light never flees in the face of darkness. It is darkness that flees in the face of light. For darkness to prevail, the source of the light must be removed. And so again, look at John 3:19 for why there's so much darkness in the world, but ultimately the light will prevail, and that's the ultimate lesson of the book of Revelation. Verse 17, when I saw him, I fell down at his feet like a dead man. He placed his right hand upon me and said, don't be afraid. I am the first and the last. And of course, we saw that in Daniel. There's also Daniel 8 has a similar passage where he fell on his face and then this person touched me, and he made him stand up. So the right hand is the hand of power, and so it's basically saying it's going to be okay. You're with me. So a very common reaction when people are given a glimpse of God, even if it's an angel, they are just absolutely terrified. And we saw the reaction of Daniel. Here's a picture of Abraham bowing before the three angels. This is in when the two angels were about to go destroy Sodom, and then one stays behind. And we see this morphing of one who starts out as an angel, but then it becomes clear that Abraham is speaking directly to who we would say God the Father. And so it's not totally unfair to see the angel of the Lord as a pre-existent version of Jesus. We call that a theophany, if you want a $10 word there. But there might even be more going on than that, because in Revelation, again, verse 1 and 22 verse 8 tell us that John received the vision from an angel. So John's talking to an angel. And so again, assuming this is John the Apostle, he knew Jesus better than anyone. So maybe the reason he was afraid was because this terrifying being wasn't really Jesus. I don't know. But even if it was Jesus, I think we can learn a lesson. So John knew Jesus. So no matter how well you know Jesus, he's still God. And we can't get too casual. And this always reminds me of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Didn't really capture it in the movie. They tried to, but it was much better in the book, much funnier in the book, actually. Susie is talking to the beaver, and the beaver says, Mr. Beaver, Aslan is a lion. The lion, a great lion. Oh, says Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. So I think there's this the movie did capture the kind of the tension. He's a lion, right? You don't get too close to a lion. You don't run up and hug a lion unless the lion welcomes you first. So I think some of that may be going on here. In any case, whoever this is, if it's Jesus or an angel, if it's an angel, then the angel has the authority to speak for Jesus in the first person. So again, the text tells us he's not speaking with Jesus directly, but in some respects he might as well be. There's really there's no difference. So to underscore the point that if these are clearly the words of Christ, even if it's not necessarily the voice of Christ, verse 18, the living one, I was dead, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and Sheol. There's only one person that can do that, and that's Jesus. Isaiah 25:8 says he will swallow up death forever. We'll look at Isaiah on the next slide. Hosea says, I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? So if those verses from Isaiah and Hosea sounded familiar, you're probably thinking of 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, the saying will come about as it is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? And he's apparently referencing these two verses. Is from Isaiah. One of them is from Isaiah 25:8, and that's what you see on the screen is the Dead Sea Scrolls copy of it's called the Great Isaiah Scroll. And so in 1948, basically the entire complete and relatively intact scroll of Isaiah, as well as every other book of the Bible except for Esther, was found in a series of caves outside the Dead Sea. And the fact that they were preserved for close to 2,000 years is just amazing. And basically, before this find, the most recent copy of the Hebrew Bible we had was from the Masoretes in the 9th or 10th century of the Common Era. And so this scroll dates to 1,000 years prior, right? Basically, the 1st century before Christ or before the Common Era. And what's fascinating is that there are minor differences only, very, very minor. And so just a really, really neat find from for the preservation of our Bible, and really authenticates our faith as being ancient. 19. So write down what you see, both what is now and what will happen afterwards. And what will happen afterwards is this Greek phrase meta tauta, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Most conservative scholars tend to see this verse as an outline of the entire book of Revelation. Now this is debated, it's not unanimously held, but basically what you see is the vision of the risen Christ, chapter 1. The things which are, or what is now, are the 7 churches or 7 assemblies in chapters 2 and 3. And then what will happen afterward is chapters 4 through 22, basically the rest of the book. So, and the Greek phrase is metatauta. It means after these things, and it acts as a signpost throughout the book. And it doesn't occur 7 times, but it actually occurs 10 times, which is interesting because in what is called Hebrew gematria, certain numbers that reappear throughout the Bible are assigned concepts. And so you've heard us say that a 7 represents completion or perfection. All that means is that scholars, both ancient sages and modern academics, have studied these patterns and then tend to notice these recurring themes. So when they see 7, they notice a general theme of completion. When they see 10, that represents divine order or law. And so the most obvious would be the 10 Commandments or the 10 Plagues. There are also 10 generations from Adam to Noah, where God restored order in the flood. So in that sense, it's no surprise that there are 10 instances of these after these things, this metatauta phrase, because it is all about God restoring order. And I've got some more examples of that on the website if you're interested. And then verse 20, here is the secret meaning of the 7 stars you saw in my right hand and of the 7 gold menorahs. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 messianic communities, and the 7 menorahs are the 7 messianic communities. And so we see again Zechariah 4:2. We looked at this earlier. What do you see? A lampstand of gold with a bowl on top of it and 7 lamps. So, but he sees a menorah. So this is an interesting astrological chart from Nineveh, and it records basically astrological and astronomical observations. They weren't quite those fields of study weren't quite so distinct in the ancient days as they are now. This is about 650 years before the birth of Jesus. And so each month is associated with a constellation, a numeral, and they really, in some respects, they knew the stars much better than we do today, unless our field is astronomy. So a topic of debate here is whether these 7 stars or angels are natural or supernatural. Now, the natural view says that the angels of each congregation are human, probably akin to the pastor of each community or perhaps a designated reader in the synagogue. And as I was studying it, about the only thing that the natural camp has going for it is that it makes sense. It makes sense. We can understand it better. We don't understand things about angels just because we haven't studied that much and we're not as familiar. But unfortunately, no church leadership position is ever called an angel anywhere else in the New Testament. So it's a bit of a stretch to see these messengers. And when we get into 2 and 3, it'll say, right unto the angel of the church of Ephesus. It's hard to see that as a human person. So in the supernatural view, these churches and fellowships have designated angels just like the nations did in Daniel 10, right? So we read that the angelic messenger had to do battle with the spirit of Persia, and then he had to go back and do battle with the spirit of Greece. So there was a physical battle going on earth, but there was also a spiritual battle happening between Michael and these other enemy spirits of these enemy nations. So in other words, there appears to be a heavenly counterpart to an earthly reality. And again, we just don't study that much, especially in the Protestant branch of the faith. So in favor of the supernatural view, the entire book of Revelation has angels all over the place. So why not in chapters 2 and 3? Why are we all of a sudden going to make these angels and say that they're just messengers when the whole rest of the book has supernatural things going on? So again, I think it's foreign for us to think of a fellowship having a guardian angel, especially when that angel doesn't always succeed in keeping division and false teaching out of the church. You think if we were all protected, our fellowships are all protected, we would have perfect churches, but we know that's not the case. So it's a bit of a mystery and something we'll have to work to untangle a little bit. The word angel or angels appears over 180 times in the New Testament, about 80 times in Revelation, and then the other 100 are scattered throughout the rest of the New Testament. So it's a bit odd in the sense that Protestants de-emphasize angels. We tend to be more rational in our outlook and our interpretation, but basically the other faith traditions don't have a problem with angels, Catholics as well as the Eastern Orthodox. Basically, there's probably a lot more going on in the supernatural angelic community than most of us realize. But in keeping with the angel discussion, it is true that in both Hebrew and Greek, the meaning could be either a supernatural angel or a natural messenger. It's the same word. However, of those 180 times, there are only about 6 times where we can be definitive that the word references only a human messenger. So you may hear this that it could mean a human messenger. That's true, but certainly in context, these appear to be supernatural beings. So that certainly raises a number of questions, right? So do our churches today have designated angels? Or was this only a first century thing? Or was it only these 7 designated churches that designated congregations that had angels? So I mean, who knows? We'll have to wait and find out. Jewish texts often portray angels as stars. And so that kind of symbolism would have been familiar to John and his audience there. So they probably saw these as supernatural angels. One point that John is possibly communicating is that Christ is Lord over the universe, including Lord over the angels who guide the churches as well as the nations. So remember, these stars were in his right hand, and that was the hand of power. Keener also notes an interesting take. Given the tensions between non-messianic and messianic branches of Judaism in that day, by identifying these congregations as a menorah, John is claiming here that the Jesus movement would actually be the truer form of Judaism. So that's kind of interesting. One thing we do know is that a menorah's purpose is to give off light in a dark place. And so on your screen, you can see a picture of the replica of menorah in the tabernacle model, and it's one piece of gold that's beaten. And so it's as you can see the picture of it there. So basically, our churches should be giving off light into a dark place, and that's what we as disciples should be doing as well. So that's really the end of the study, but as a postscript, I did want to do a side-by-side with Revelation 1 and Daniel 10, so we can see how the book that we hold in our laps or reading on our smart devices is one book. It's not 66 books, it's one book with one consistent message from beginning to end. So basically, both Daniel and 10 have this double introduction, I, Daniel, and then Revelation says, I, John. They're both surrounded by water. So Daniel was standing on the bank of the Tigris, and John was on the island called Patmos. They were both in a state of spiritual preparation. So Daniel was in Daniel 10, he was mourning for 3 weeks and fasting for 3 weeks. And we aren't told in what state John was in, but he was in the spirit on the Lord's day. And so he was prepared for such an event that he got. The listener notices, so Daniel lifted up my eyes and looked. John turned to see. We have the being's clothing is very similar, clothed in linen, a belt of fine gold in Daniel, clothed with a long robe and a golden sash around his chest in Revelation. Head and face like the appearance of lightning. In Daniel 7, we have his head being pure wool, the hair of his head. And then we have the similar thing in Revelation 1. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. Continuing, his eyes were like flaming torches. His eyes were like a flame of fire in Revelation. His arms and legs were bronze. His feet were bronze in Revelation. Sound of his words were like the sound of a multitude, and his voice was the roar of many waters. The reaction, when he heard the sound, Daniel fell on his face. And when John heard the sound, he fell on his face, though dead at his feet. Commission, and behold, a hand touched me. And then John, he laid his right hand on me. Assurance, they both get the assurance, fear not. And then the mission. So Daniel came, the messenger came to Daniel saying, make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. And then John says, write the things you have seen, the things that are, and things that take place. So they're all being given this the special peek behind the curtain. So in conclusion, these are quotes from Chuck Missler. He said, the New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, while the Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed. And he would often say 66 books with one integrated message. And then he would say that message is a love letter written in blood on a wooden cross. So just all of this to remind us as we head into Revelation, this is all one integrated book. And we'll have fun digging into all of the references that go into John's letter here. So we will see you next time when we dig into the church at Ephesus.